Welcome to the Intelligent Teams podcast, where we interview leading thinkers from business and the sciences of mind to find new ways to help your teams and organizations thrive. I'm your host, Daniel Susser. Welcome back to Intelligent Teams. This week on Intelligent Teams, we are speaking to an expert in the neuroscience of coaching, Ann Betz. Welcome, Ann, to Intelligent Teams.
Thank you, Daniel. I'm excited for our conversation, so thank you.
Me too. Ann, how would you introduce yourself and your work to others?
Probably the simplest way is to say, first of all, I've been a professional coach since about 2001. And in that role, I have taught coaching at every level. I've developed coaching programs. So I'm pretty well-grounded in what coaching is. And then about 15 years ago or so, I started seeing neuroscience come into the popular kind of conversation, I might say. It was just starting then about 2010, 2011. And I really thought, there's something here that helps us understand human development. I need to understand more about that. So I started studying neuroscience at the graduate level. I I just wanted to understand people and their motivations better from a scientific perspective, not just a psychological perspective. And what I found very early on was so much of what we were doing in coaching that I didn't know why it worked was actually validated by these neuroscience studies that hadn't been done on coaching, that had just been done on human beings, like what happens when we reflect on our values, or what happens when we shift a perspective, things like that. And it gave me this answer to a question I didn't know that I really had, which is, why does coaching work? So since about 2011, 2012 in there, I've been teaching and writing about, here's my best sort of retrofit looking at the science as to why coaching works.
Great. What was it that attracted you to coaching in the first place?
I think I just actually posted something about this, that my attraction to coaching really has to do with, I was a philosophy undergrad, and it really has to do with the sort of existential view of what is it to live a life of meaning, of purpose? What is happiness? Really, what is fulfillment? And how do you help people not just get more stuff, but how do you help people live the lives they're here to live, discover what that is, and then move into that? So I really became a coach for that. And I see it as a way of elevating human consciousness, and I see it as a way of healing. And I think the two go hand in hand. And what I found is neuroscience really validates that way of looking at coaching, not just the, hey, how do you get more from a sort of an external state? So that's what attracted me to it. And I still, 25 years later this fall, it'll be, I still love it. I still have one-to-one clients. I think it's an awesome tool in technology.
You answered the question that I was going to ask, which was, you might think that neuroscience is dry, it's brains, which I guess are wet, but it's more, it's and
unless they're from Amazon, yes, they're wet. Brain.
Yes. Gesticulates to jar of dried brains in the background. Yeah.
I've never touched a real brain, but I do keep this one around because it's useful. It's a useful prop.
Yeah, okay. Maybe we'll point to that, and then we can try and do like an audio description for people that are listening without the video, and be like, it's like she's pointing at the thing, yeah.
It's just a plastic brain that is about actually the size of a real human brain. So I just keep it as a prop.
Great.
I'm sorry, what were you going to ask me though?
Yeah, so I was gonna say about how neuroscience, theoretical, the physiology of a brain and all these structures, and your interest being in elevating human experience and consciousness. And can you say a bit more about how neuroscience supports that, rather than my assumption might have been that it's the different ends of the spectrum? Yeah.
Yeah, like there are sort of people who are more interested in the heart and, kind of awareness. And then there are people that are just interested in the science. And so let me start with a quote, and I will promise you I will mess up this name because I do not speak French, but it is from a French theologian named Teilhard de Chardin. And he said a number of really cool things, one of which was science, philosophy, and religion are bound to converge as each draws nearer to the whole. So this is something that fascinates me, is the convergence of these things, and that as we understand more, we see how they are interrelated and not separate. And so I'm looking for a really practical example from the brain, but the reason that I really started studying the brain was not for coaching kind of came a little after, but I really wanted to know, what is it about human beings that has them operate more or less effectively, more or less in awareness? And is there something that is pretty hardcore, not just a psychological theory, but a real, what do we see in the brains of people that are operating in ways that are really pro-social? They have really good outcomes in their life. They have really good relationships. They're very able to both inspire and manage teams. How are their brains different? Now, that's a big, big question, and you're not going to find one study, right? So I have spent, since 2011, so 15 years, I've spent 15 years looking at the individual aspects of this to see, okay, where is the pattern leading us? And I can tell you the what I call the deceptively simple, endlessly complex answer. And we'll see what the cognitive scientists think of this. But the deceptively simple, endlessly complex answer is that people who operate in more effective ways in every area of their life, not just they know how to make money, but they know how to be a good parent and a good team leader and a good human in the world. And they're resilient and they're heart-centered and everything we would want in an admirable human being. That those people in many different areas of their brain show more of what we would call integration. So that's a whole complex thing, but it's basically, I'll give you a very clear example. There's a debate in leadership. And I don't think, it used to be a bigger debate, and now I think people are more aware. But here's the question. Why are some leaders good at people and other leaders are good at process? Like you have your process people and you have your people, right? Relationship versus details. And what the research shows is that the best leaders, and I can tell you kind of how we know that, like, how do you know what the best leader is? Because you don't ask them, right? You actually ask the people around them. And then you can do some brain scanning and see what. Yeah, yes, I'm the best leader. There's no other leaders ever as good as me. But you look to see what kind of impact they're actually having on the brains of the people around them. That's a really gold standard study that's been done. So you look to see, are their brains in a state where they're open, where they're emotionally available, where they're creative, where they're at areas that are associated with vision are lining up? Then one of the researchers calls this a toward state. So what do you want in a leader is leaders who activate a toward state in their people. Everything positive goes with that. They're going to be smarter. They're going to be more creative. They're going to be more collaborative. They're going to see more possibilities. You don't want leaders who evoke an away state, which is shut down, emotionally defensive, or just kind of like nothing much going on if you put them in a brain scanner. So this is what we want. So here's what we know. Leaders who understand that it is not an either or, that they need to pay attention to the humans and they need to pay attention to the process. And that is, like balancing on a tightrope sometimes. But really, that's who creates the best response in their followers. And that's what we would call integration. They have an awareness of what is needed and they're able to do both. And that's not just in terms of that issue of like people versus process, but it's true in every area. Like they are aware of what's going on in their body, and they also have an ability to cognitively assess it and calm themselves down. So it's not just that they're leading from a somatic place, but the somatic information is integrated with the cognitive relationship. So let me pause there, but that's and I'll probably spend the rest of my life exploring what this actually means because it's really interesting, fascinating, complex, but I have not seen a better explanation.
It's also a relevant question for a seeking person in themselves, right? Because this isn't studying the makeup of rocks on the moon. This is how do other people become better people? And I would make a guess that becomes a relevant personal question. Like, well, and also, how do I embody some of that as well? I want to be like them in some way.
Yeah,
Is that true for you? That's what came up for me, at least.
No, totally. And I can't remember who said this, but there was a neuroscientist who said, the brain doesn't distinguish between being a good leader and being a good parent. You're using the same neural patterning. So, if you are reactive at work because you don't know how to manage your emotional response to things, you are probably also going to be reactive at home. It's not like we're not so contextually compartmentalized generally. So when we get better at, understanding what our body is telling us and working with that in productive ways, we become better everywhere.
Can you there's a question I want to ask about, or go further into that that generic quality of, I don't know whether you'd call it intelligence or integration or capability or whatever it is. Before we do, can we put a pin in that question? So I'm saying that so I don't forget it. But first I want to ask a little bit about, you've mentioned the body a few times, and maybe a listener would have the question, which is, well, we're talking about brains. Brains I understand. I don't understand, but I understand that I don't understand. It's the thing that sits in my skull. It does all the thinking, and it's where my thoughts are, and it has words and pictures, and it helps me plan, and it helps me remember things. Why are we talking about the body in the context of neuroscience? What's that got to do with it? Could you share a bit more about that?
Well, it's really interesting because when we first came on the call and I said, what are we talking about today? And you said a really important word. You said the mind. And so what we have to think about is that we are not a bunch of brains walking around. We are actually what we're working with, and what we're working with in human development and what we're working with personally is we're working with our minds. And so famously, there's a famous neuroscience expert, psychiatrist, really wise guy named Dan Siegel. You might be familiar with him. And Dan Siegel has this very interesting speech that he gives where he basically says, like, those of us who are therapists, coaches, counselors, leadership experts, all of that, we are actually working with the mind. But most of us have no idea what the mind is. like I'm going to hold up my brain again for those that are listening, like I can point to this brain, like, and to some degree we've had some success in finding some stuff in the brain, but it's only a portion of the issue, because the brain is part of the mind. The mind contains, but is not limited to, the brain. So we have to look at something that in cognitive science is generally referred to as embodied cognition. The other way that it's referred to is the extended mind. That the mind is not, it is distributed. Who we are is our minds, not just our brains. So you have to think about our knowing, our personality, who we are, how we process information is actually distributed. It's not all just in our heads. It is, we use our bodies, and how our bodies walk in the world and are in relationship to each other and the environments that we're in shapes our mood, how we think, our resilience, our emotions, things like that. Our mind includes our relationship to each other. So we are shaped by the systems that we're in and the people that we're around. And while we have personal responsibility and personal, I don't want to use the word control, but sort of personal influence, like what I want for me and what I do for me makes a difference. It's not the only thing that does. And so if you grow up in an environment that is full of very negative, very difficult people, your physical environment is, dirty and broken windows and, just boarded up buildings and all of that, it will shape your mind to adapt to that in different ways than if you grow up with access to nature, around people who believe in you, people who are, curious about you rather than judgmental. Your mind will adapt to that. And some of that is how your brain patterns, but some of it is also how your nervous system is responding. So we are complicated. And I will tell you, this is why I do not believe AI will ever rule the world, because we think with the entirety of our beings, including the energy between us. And you cannot replicate that unless you replicate a real human being. You're just replicating language. AI is just replicating language. And no matter how much language you feed into it, it's not the same as a human experience, which is an embodied experience. I will pause there.
Yeah, that's a lovely response. And it's so, I was thinking as you were just sharing that about the embodied nature of mind. Once that twigged for me, that set off a whole cascade of exploration and noticing, and it's a real perspective shift. When I realized that my dog, Brian, who doesn't think verbally, as far as I'm aware, but nonetheless has a body and a sense of when he's safe or not, and will react and will, he's like sort of like a lower order consciousness, says the person that puts themselves on the top of the order of consciousness. But he's doesn't have that verbal level where it's not in the same way that I think, but nonetheless has these very clear mind, clearly has some sort of personality, behaviors, all these things to interact with, but doesn't have the verbal bit, doesn't have the little internal voice saying, now go do this, now go do that. So I probably do as well. I also have the voice that's telling me, do this, do that, remembering things, coming up with images, but I've got all this other data that's flowing, and maybe data flowing is a limited analogy as well, but I've got all this other information, all this other access to this stuff that's going on, that is beating my heart for me. It is telling me whether I'm safe, whether or not my brain is caught up with it, whether or not my thinking mind is caught up. How does it feel to be in a room by yourself versus with another person? It feels different. That matters. And when we're thinking about
depending on depending on the energy that that other person is bringing.
Yeah.
And I think
Who that
about,
person
I'm
is.
curious
Yeah.
if you've had a similar experience. So I love my business partner. She's amazing. She's co-created much of what we do, and she's just amazing. And I always notice that I'm funnier around her. Because she thinks I'm really, really funny. And so when I'm with her, I'm funnier. And that's an example of, that's not weakness on my part. That's not lack of clear personality or anything. That's how the energy field between us pulls for a little more of that part of my personality. It turns up the dial. Now, if I didn't have that in my personality, it probably wouldn't create it, right? But she turns up the volume a bit on my humor, which is one of the things I love. I love experiencing it's all about me. So I love experiencing myself that way, because she'll laugh at things that I didn't even intend to be funny. And then I get, it's this positive spiral where I get funnier anyway. So, and I think we've had that experience where if you think on the sort of like the people where you're funnier, the people where you feel smarter, and then there are the people where you feel stupid, because they're engaged in a hierarchical competition that you don't want to be engaged in. And they are using their energy in a way that's rewarding to them to make you feel small. And, it's this kind of like, why do I feel so tongue-tied around this person? Or like what I'm saying doesn't have any value, where I can go talk to my partner and they're fascinated by everything I say. So who am I really, right?
Yeah.
Have you
And the
had
answer
that?
is
I'm just curious if you had that experience.
yeah, 100%. Like, who am I? Well, it depends. It depends where I am, depends what I'm wearing, depends who I'm talking to, depends what I'm talking about, depends on a bunch of other stuff going on. So there being this finite me that exists, that breaks down really quickly when you start asking questions like this. It's like,
I
well, if I'm a
love
different
that.
person with my girlfriend or with my boss or with my parents, what was it? Was it Ram Dass who says, if you think you're enlightened, go spend a weekend with your parents? So like we're not just constrained to the edge of our skin and the things that we believe about ourselves, and
And
that's
I'm
scary and
really,
freeing.
it's scary and freeing. And I think one of the ways of thinking about goes to the research, so it does go back to the science, is when we're thinking about behavior, toxic or positive or whatever, it is largely determined by personality. And personality is very stable throughout life. And so I'm thinking about, I have an expertise, I was mentioning to you, I have an expertise in toxic personalities. I've done a lot of work around psychopaths and narcissists and what that's like in a relationship, what that's like in the workplace, things like that. And, the traditional view up until fairly recently has been that these are people who were traumatized. They have insecure attachment. They were, very badly damaged as children. And the zeitgeist is turning, and people are becoming more vocal about. The research basically says that is probably not the main reason that people develop these personality types, that it's much more genetic. But I love this analogy that genetics, so nature or epigenetics, the way the gene is expressed, nature versus nurture, that nature writes the music. Nurture or epigenetics turns up or turns down the volume. But that we have these propensities, and so if somebody is, literally a psychopath or highly narcissistic, that is not because they were damaged as a child, that's a personality, but the fact that they had trauma as a child may have turned up the volume on how they behave, whether they're violent or not, things like that. So if you are, for example, a diagnosed psychopath, and you were raised in a very loving family, what the research says is you may not act out in criminally violent ways, but you're probably still acting fairly. There's going to be some criminality there, most likely, or very bad behavior, because it's just part of the personality, but you're probably not going to become a serial killer. There's less likelihood you'll be a serial killer, that there's an interaction there. So we don't say that, epigenetics or trauma is off the hook, but we cannot put the full explanation on it. And I do think this is really important. And it links to why, like as a coach, if I suspected somebody was very high in narcissism or worse, believe me, I am not going there as a coach. First of all, they scare me. I don't know what they're going to do. I don't trust them. And secondly, I'm going to give them to somebody who has really good expertise in this field. And thirdly, you can't help them. As much as you want to, as much as your heart wants to help them, you can't. Because it's personality. So it's not healing trauma.
And your interest as a coach is working where you can help heal trauma more. I want to
work with the people they've impacted, where their nervous system is now dysregulated, where their belief in themselves has been negatively impacted, where they've stopped trusting their intuition, where they don't know who they are anymore, to whatever degree, or they're just trying to make sense of how can somebody act like this. And I want to work with the people who are capable of healing. And that's most people.
That's a relief.
But it's not everybody.
Yeah. How did you end up interested in psychopaths and narcissists?
Because I ended up in a relationship with one. A lot of us end up there. And I will be very honest and say, even I was a neuroscience expert at the time, I was not an expert in this. I met this person like 9 years ago. And I knew a lot about neuroscience. I was teaching neuroscience. I thought I knew a ton about how human beings operated, and I did, but I didn't know the dark side. And I bought into a lot of the myths in coaching, which is everybody's naturally creative, resourceful, and whole. You just have to love them. You just have to help them come into awareness. You just have to, be this person for them that maybe they've never had. And, you can, and you have to look at yourself. Where am I contributing? How am I responsible if our relationship is breaking down or we're having a fight? And, and you keep your promises about things. This is all part of my training, all part of my background. And I got involved with this person who was a master manipulator and who got involved with me because there was something he wanted, not because he was in love with me. And I was manipulated by one of the best. And as I got out of it, I was just like, I think the good quality or bad quality that I have is you don't mess with me because I'm going to try to figure it out. Like I want to understand, like, how did I get hooked in? How do other smart people get hooked in? I was not codependent. I was happily independent. But you get a master con artist, think about like the Tinder swindler and people like that. They don't target broken people. They target people who are successful and have something they want. And then, can manipulate and mess with us in ways that we're not even aware of are happening. So that's how I got fascinated about it, because I didn't want it to happen to anybody else. I wanted to bring this more into light and along with, a million other people who are now speaking more about this. So, certainly not on my own, but yeah.
Yeah, I guess like the sort of generic point there, which I'm interested in exploring, is like we show up to work, let's say, because ultimately I'm interested in teams, or we show up to team situations, yeah, and we maybe believe ourselves to be these like impervious, stable characters that put out a CV and I apply for a job and I go in there and I am me and I am I'm a rock, I'm an island, and you will get me in my form.
I think there's a song about that, isn't there?
Yeah, maybe. And And actually, when I show up in a social setting, because we're such social creatures, and like we were talking about earlier, who I am might shift depending on the culture that I'm in. Even if I am the most integrated, whole, grounded, I'm at my best. If you put me in a room or in a power dynamic with personalities or people who, at the extreme end, narcissists and psychopaths, and everywhere between, that and normal, that will impact how I am and how I show up in my work, in myself. So you mentioned that if there's a narcissist in the picture, or if there's a diagnosed psychopath, it's hard to work with a team organism like that. But what about the less extreme ends where people are being impacted by the strong characters around them, or the power dynamics that are playing out between them and their other colleagues? How do you work with that? How do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think it's a really important question for teams. So if it is someone who is really, and we're not qualified to diagnose, but sort of looks like it, smells like it, it's like a personality disorder that no matter what, and there are some red flags for this, and let me just talk about that, and then I'll talk about what to do with the people who are just difficult. So the red flags would be, at the extreme level, no conscience. And we do know, it's too bad, but we do know that there's a couple of places where psychopaths, which is the worst of the worst, absolutely no conscience, absolutely limited. They have different brains where they don't have they really, like if you ask a psychopath what you're afraid of, they will probably tell you nothing. And it's probably true. Like they're not afraid of getting caught. Life is just sort of, people are just like chess pieces to move around, and no conscience. And they cluster at the CEO C-suite level because they're very motivated by power and control and status. And they cluster in high security prisons. These are the two places you're most likely to find them. Either end. And there's a really good book that I'll just mention called Snakes in Suits, if you want to know about sort of psychopaths in the workplace. So when you've got somebody at that end, it's like, do they show real remorse for what happened? Like, I'll give you an example of a guy who was difficult for his team, but not a narcissist or psychopath. So I had this very smart guy that I was coaching, super smart. He ran a team. He was a scientist, and he was really smart, but he was very quick to send sarcastic, scathing emails based on that nobody was as smart as he was. And his team, guess what, did not like that very much. They didn't like it at all. And so we had to do some work in coaching around, I basically told him he wasn't allowed to send an email, because what would happen is somebody would respond in a way he thought was stupid because he had a freaking IQ of like 160. And there were lots of things that people did that, according to him, were kind of stupid. So he had a lockdown on whether he could respond by email. I think I gave him a 24-hour pause. And that was his assignment. Like, you have to wait 24 hours and you have to think about, how is this going to impact the person who you're sending it to? And the difference between him and somebody who was just out for power and control is he felt bad. And so I remember this very, very breakthrough session that we had where we get on the phone. I'm like, how's it going? He's like, I did it again. I did it again. I said, you told me not to. I sent the email. Now I've got, this really upset person on my team. And so I said, okay, what's that going to cost you? He said, and he was so smart. He was doing this analysis. He's like, well, it's probably going to cost me about 2 weeks before she's willing to, trust me again. And it's going to be 2 weeks of me doing repair. And I feel terrible about it. It's not and he would say things like, it's not the kind of leader I want to be. You've got to help me with this. And I could feel And this is part of me trusting my body and my intuition. That was not lip service. He genuinely, this was a habit. It's a very academic habit, and it's a bad habit. And he wanted to change it. So that's an example of a great place for coaching. And I would say it was one of those coaching gigs where I was hired by his company, and I think I had 6 sessions. He was so smart. He really did have movement within 6 sessions. I wish I could have worked with him for a year, because I think he would have really changed as a human being. Highly motivated. Did not like just didn't know how to have a different impact. I don't know, so that's really different than somebody who is hurting people because it's kind of fun or entertaining, or it's the ladder that they see to success. And I've got lots of examples, not from coaching, but from like movies and TV shows of people doing this, and no remorse, no conscience. I can't work with that. This guy I can work with.
Yeah, makes sense. And what would your advice be to someone in a team with someone like this guy who not a psychopath, but making life really difficult for them?
Yeah, and it's sometimes really hard to know, but one of the ways to see is, do I get a sincere apology? Can I, sit them down at a calm time and say, look, dude, I need to let you know this isn't working. And do they listen? Or do they, there's a well-known, I'll give you this very interesting acronym. So it's the question of, do they listen? Do they say, yeah, I know I have a bad habit. I'm going to work on that. And actually what I want, Daniel, is I want you to point out to me when I do it again. Because I'm working with a coach. I'm really trying to get better. Do they get a sincere engagement? Now, if what they do is something called DARVO, DARVO, it's a great acronym, and it stands for defend, attack, reverse, victim, and offender. So if they say, I don't do that, like you do that, like you're constantly, saying, sarcastic things to me, and I don't, I should get a medal for just putting up with you. So I've defended, I don't do it. I'm attacking you. I'm saying, well, you're the one who does that, which is projection. And then I'm saying, I'm the victim here, actually. So if they DARVO you, yeah, don't give any more energy to it. And you need to look to see, what's the extent my nervous system can handle this? Should I be looking for a different manager or a different job? Because you are not going to change them if that's what they do.
DARVO. How do you know DARVOing isn't also a habit that they've learned that can be unlearned?
It's a good. I think because it's a really good question. I think because good people who actually want to be good leaders, who just are stuck in bad patterns, if you sit down and, have a calm conversation with them, or a mediated conversation perhaps with a team coach, and you say, here's how I'm feeling about this, they will not hang on to that. They might do it a bit at first. It's normal to be defensive, right? It's not normal to necessarily always attack or make yourself the victim. It's normal to be defense is I don't do that. Do I? And so it really has to do with how committed they become. And I'd have to look and see. I'm really pondering that, but I think I think the defensiveness is the habit, but I don't think I think the attack and the reversal is showing you somebody without very much self-awareness.
Yeah. With a self-interested lens, I'm sort of thinking about recent conflicts I've had. I'm like, did I do that? Did I, when I'm feeling extra defensive, do I have the ability to do that? Because that voice, might come up, which is like, why should I have to put up with this? I'm da 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 da. And then it's like having the awareness
Yeah.
to be like, hang on, I'm doing it. I'm not listening. So yeah, it's an interesting one.
I think that's fair. And I do think being defensive is for me, it's within the bounds of human responsiveness that is not necessarily toxic, unless it is always never taking responsibility. Now, if somebody says to me, I don't think I do that. Do I do that? Can you give me an example of when I've done that? And then you're like, yeah, here's an email you sent me where you told me I was stupid and I don't like how that feels and I don't want to work for someone who tells me that I'm stupid. And they go, oh, yeah, I did send that email. But if they gaslight you, I didn't send that email. What proof do you have that I sure didn't. I would never send an email like that. And you're like, it's your email signature. You said that to me in a meeting in front of 3 witnesses and they're still denying it. We probably can't
We
work with
can't
that.
work with that. Yeah, that makes
Right.
sense. I wonder.
Or when they're calm. And this is the other thing. It's like when we're hot, more likely to be defensive, to project things like that. But if we have a conversation, you sort of bookmark it and go, Daniel, can I talk about what happened last week? Because it's really not sitting right with me. And do you actually have bandwidth right now to talk about this? Because it feels like there's something off in our relationship. And you're not hot, you're less likely to be defensive about it.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could share any approaches for people who notice themselves in situations like that where the perspective's changing from like, I'm in a team with a person like this to like, oh, maybe I am the person that's causing the difficulty. Like how to make it easier for yourself to receive difficult feedback or to progress on some of that work that you would need to do to become a better leader.
Yeah, I think feedback's tough. I do. Actually, feedback's hard because here's what happens for us, I believe, and there's people who are bigger experts on this, but if I just look at this, why is feedback hard for us? Shouldn't we all just want to grow and develop? Well, because we are social beings, as you have mentioned, where it's really important to us to belong to whatever group we identify with. For most people, now psychopaths don't care, but for most of us, we do want to feel like we belong. And when we have somebody go like, hey, that's unacceptable, how we process that is literally as if we are being rejected from the group, and that's incredibly painful. And there's even evidence that says we may process that sort of at the level of survival. Like if you reject me, it is triggering sort of death warnings here because we need each other to survive. And historically, on the savannah when the lions are coming, you're not going to survive on your own. So it's kind of programmed in for us to not want to hear anything that feels like it separates us from anyone else. But, so my tips for this, off the top of my head, I taught a class on this once, but what I remember from what I said was be thoughtful, certainly be thoughtful about how you give it, make sure it's the right time and that the person has bandwidth. When somebody's going through whole lot of other stresses in their life, which is why team leaders really need to know their team. So, they're going through, issues with their kids, issues with their parents, a failed launch of something, and everything is adding into the stress. It's probably not the time to go like, hey, what the hell's going on? Right? So it's timing. And often it's making sure the person feels they have a choice about something. because that makes us feel more empowered and less defensive. So even saying, I really kind of want to talk about, let's unpack like what happened with that launch. I really want to look at that. When is a good time for you? I know you have a lot of other things going on right now. It's probably critical that we talk about it in the next 2 weeks, but it's not critical we talk about it today. So tell me when would be good for you. So that actually puts the brain in a less defensive state. The other thing sort of so you can't always rely on that the people around you are going to do that, because sometimes they do what I like to call drive-by feedback. You're just like, what just happened here? Like that. So I was in a situation a couple of years ago where I was building a program for a different organization. So in my organization, we don't do that. Like, we are very careful, we are very thoughtful. We usually talk about let's unpack it rather than let me give you feedback with this understanding, like let's try to figure out what happened in the system and what do we each need to be responsible for. So we have we have a culture where we do that for the most part. I know what I was going to say, but in this organization, they had a culture which was sort of quick, direct, boom. And everybody was just supposed to like be fine with that. And I really wasn't fine with it, And so what I did is I actually looked at how am I going to manage this, because I really liked them and I liked what I was doing for them. I just didn't like this. And I didn't feel like I had the energy to change their culture, and it kind of wasn't my role. And so interestingly, so I came up with a metaphor. So I went out and I bought myself this rock. And the rock was to remind me that no matter what anybody says, I'm whole and complete. I'm fine. And I can take what I want and leave what I don't want. And this is sort of to remind me of my innate value. And that's what, that's one of the things that I do around that, because I don't like that kind of feedback. It's not how I operate, but I know there are organizations where that's their culture. So,
and you use that rock as a kind of like a talisman or something for representing your own ability to withstand that culture or something like that.
Yeah, this rock it's beautiful. It's hard. It would be very hard to crack it or carve in it. That's me. And so they can give me feedback, but it's not, I don't need to take it as this is me. And I needed something to this has been on my desk for like 4 years, because I really find it helpful in terms of remembering that lots of people can have lots of opinions, and sometimes they're useful. Sometimes the feedback's useful, but it does not need to change me.
Yeah, and there's a big difference between saying, I've heard this before, people say, well, someone shared feedback that I was too loud in that meeting, and then someone shared feedback that I was too quiet in the meeting afterwards. So what am I supposed to do with that? I'm like, well, that kind of tells you about them and what they want, and might be legitimate, and it tells you about the situation maybe, but like, it's your job to then like take that and make sense of it, and what is you and what's situational and what that person needs at that time. Or so they're sharing something that is probably valuable, but yeah, it's not they don't know your soul to be able to say this is what you should do always.
Right. And this is why it's so helpful for folks to have a coach, so the coach can say, okay, well, so what do you want to own? What do you not want to own? What feels like it's useful? What's actually not useful? Because manipulators, by the way, will lie, and I have been told, like the guy that I was involved with would tell me things that, about, like, one of my favorites was he told me that I embarrassed people because of my public displays of affection. And I'm actually not a particularly touchy-feely person. Like, I don't actually, and it was just like, wow. If I were to take that on, that's a version of me that I don't know. right? Like I had to sort of go, and that was actually one of the things that woke me up, because he was telling me I was someone that there was no other evidence for. And that's the other thing that I would ask a client, who's like, told me I was too loud, told me I was too quiet. Well, what's the other evidence that you have? How does this stack up? And because it's very possible that, especially the person who said she was too loud, has a hidden motive for trying to shut her down. That's super possible. Might not be, but we need to look at the whole broader spectrum there.
Yeah,
I would say.
on.
Yeah. And I will share one other thing, then we can drop this, we can go on. But I was listening to a really good couples therapist, and they asked him, when couples come in for counseling and you suspect there's something else going on here, like, how do you know? Is it this equal thing, or is there one person who's kind of creating more of the drama? How do you even know, right? And he said this great answer. He said, how I know who to trust, whose version of reality to trust when they're very different, is it's the person who's authentically doing the work. Like, if I assign them, write a letter to your partner, they'll come back with a 6-page letter, and the other person just be like, I don't know, that seemed kind of stupid. Who is engaged in actually trying to make the relationship better, and who comes into counseling with a lot of excuses? And I think the same is true in the workplace. If you have workplace conflict and you're trying to figure out, is this a manipulator? Is this somebody who's just being really victim-y? It's who's doing the work to try to actually have clean communication, who's trying to resolve it, and who's just giving you lots of, maybe charm, but charming excuses.
Yeah, that's one to reflect on. I want to go back to some of the more neuroscience-y questions. And there was a question that came up when we were talking earlier, which is, well, we're talking about neuroscience here. We're talking about bodies and self and senses and things. And we're not quite talking about what I might associate with neuroscience, amygdalas and prefrontal cortices and hemispheres and, neurons, etc. And fill in brainy words there. I thought that was curious, is that we were having a conversation ostensibly about neuroscience, but without really dealing with neuroscience there. And I was wondering, like, one of the things that we were speaking about before the recording started was I'm generally quite neuroscience skeptic when it comes to how we involve things in coaching. And it's very easy to say, and I've done this, I've gone to conferences and says neuroscience of coaching or of something, and then I've presented one thing that is anatomically true, but not the whole picture. I know what I'm talking about, and do a sort of shallow skim of a topic, and then people go and go, wow, I learned some neuroscience from someone who knows what they're talking about. And having done that, and then having looked back on it and gone oh, that wasn't very responsible, you realize there's a lot of that out there, and neuroscience changes, or what we think is true changes. It's very complex and complicated as well. Having a brain area that lights up during an activity doesn't really tell me the role of that brain activity. It just tells me that something's firing in there. Any more than looking at the processor, which processors are going off in my computer doesn't tell me the computation that's happening. So, so there's a bunch of questions within that, which is maybe I'll give you a little assiette of questions and you can zoom in.
Okay. There's a lot that I could say about this, but go ahead.
Yeah. So one question is, when it comes to knowing about the detail of how brains work and knowing your V1 pathway from your A1 whatever, and actually getting into the detail, how much do you need to be able to do that in order to have a coherently neuroscience informed conversation? Maybe let's start there and see where we get to.
Let's just bookmark the rest, because there's a lot there. One is that, to me, there's a difference between theoretical or I don't know what the word I'm looking for, but what I say that I do is applied neuroscience. So what's interesting to me in terms of coaching is what's useful for people. And getting too technical is generally off-putting and not useful. And I have to walk a real fine edge between going, okay, what's useful, but what's accurate. And what is, there's that famous saying, it was not Einstein, it was another physicist, and it'll come to me maybe who it was. But basically, they asked, if this might have been Feynman, where they said, can you teach this concept to a freshman physics class? And he said, I'll get back to you. And he came back like a week later and he said, I can't. And here's why: I don't understand it well enough. I can't explain it simply because I don't understand it well enough. So I really go by, if I can't explain it simply, I don't understand it well enough. And what I'm going to do is look for the things in neuroscience that I can explain reasonably simply using regular language so that it is useful to the client. It may be very big picture. It may not be very fine-tuned. Occasionally I get a client like somebody like you where it's like, okay, let's go to all the real depth of this. But I'm always walking the line as a teacher and as a coach of saying, okay, this needs to be accurate. I'm not going to say something that's inaccurate. But the full story may be bigger than this, but what I'm going to give you is the really useful part that's still accurate. So for example, if I'm working with right and left hemisphere, very controversial, by the way, and you probably know this because we used to say people are right-brained or left-brained, and now we know I'm involved. I like this line from actually I think he's at Cambridge guy named Ian McGilchrist, who's just brilliant, where he says, not what they do, it's how they do it. So the right hemisphere is involved in language, but in a very different way than the left hemisphere. They're both involved in emotions, but in very different ways. So it's not the what, it's the how. And we are separate. We do have two hemispheres, and we are specialized, because that's part of how we're able to have bigger brains. So there is a difference between the right and the left, but it's not so much about which one's dominant, it's how are they playing their music together in any particular context. So anyway, what I was going to say, sort of walking that fine edge, is that if I'm using this with a client, I will have them think of or draw, basically, let me see if I got a pen here. I'll have them draw 4 quadrants like that. And I will say, okay, we have your right hemisphere and your left hemisphere, and they both operate in helpful ways and also in over-calibrated ways. And I'm going to give you 4 words for what happens when they're helpful and when they're over-calibrated. So in the right hemisphere, let me just do this real quick. What we get in a helpful state, we call it above the line. What we get at the higher level is the right hemisphere is all-encompassing. It's very open. There are certain aspects that go along with that. It takes in all the information, gives us a sense of freedom. When you take freedom too far, that becomes chaos. So we got helpful, but we got a problem if we go too far with it, chaos. In the left hemisphere, what we get above the line is structure, gives us the ability to narrow things down, to analyze, to filter out things. But if you take structure too far, you get rigidity, and that's not helpful. And so so that's it. That's like how I'm going to explain the right and left hemisphere. Very simple, very accurate. Now, we might go through a process where I have you go, like, let's go stand in the chaos quadrant and tell me what that feels like and what that's like in your life and how you operate from there. And do you have a metaphor? And we're going to explore, we're going to put some meat around the bones of all of this, but I'm going to keep it pretty simple because that's what the client needs. They don't need to know about the ion channels, right? Does that answer the question?
I think so, yeah. So a follow on from that is like how in depth do you as a neuroscience informed coach or a neuroscience based coach like need to go in that? Because I could say there where the graph you just drew there it's more of like a cognitive one than a neuroscience one, right? Like
It's a neuroscience one.
it's a neuroscience one in that it does correlate to left and right hemisphere, but that could be true of any cognizing system, that it needs to have enough freedom without descending into chaos, and needs to have enough structure without descending into rigidity. The fact that it happens to correlate to left and right hemisphere, that's nice, sure.
Okay.
It doesn't fully like integrate there, but this is a super useful coaching tool, and like I can use the familiar language so of left and right hemisphere to like help you make sense of that. I don't know if that's maybe missing something in what you're intending there, but I guess my question is like, do you really need to know what's happening in the left and right hemispheres to use? Do you need to know about the ion channels and have gone into the depth with the split brain patient studies, which are fascinating, and that kind of stuff, or or is it right to say like, hey, I read a thing and I reckon I could coaching that up enough, and maybe I won't call it neuroscience, but it could be useful. Like, what do you think the in-depth study there affords? That
Okay, so there's sort of four things.
yeah,
One is, if I can remember, let me go to three. There's three. Let me go first to three layers, and then we'll see if there's a fourth thing. So there's
great.
three layers of what we need to know. There's what I need to know as an expert and a teacher, and I need to know as much as I can. Now, I don't like I need to know if there are different neurotransmitters operating. I need to know I've read like the split brain studies. I need to know how the left hemisphere can compensate sometimes in brain damage. Like I need to have as big a background as I've got to be a legitimate teacher. And that's what I've spent, the last 15 years doing, and I continue to do as we learn more. So I got to know that. Then I'm going to be training coaches. And I train coaches who are already trained as coaches. We call them advanced coaches, but it's basically just you already know how to coach, and we're just going to add on neuroscience. They need to know more than their client knows. They need to, so this is very basic. It's very high level. Now, when I'm teaching it, we talk more about why is that? What are the particular, let's talk about the language areas of the brain and how they operate. Let's talk about what this means that the left hemisphere has more of an association with structure. Let's look at different, what we know from the research, like all the different aspects that we can associate more with left and more with right. So I've got a depth of knowledge as a coach that I can grab onto when and if it's needed, depending on the client. But I also have more confidence that I'm not just parroting, what Ann said, like out of this conversation, like, oh, no, I would not teach it just like that. As a client, as someone who is coming to me to say, I don't know why I can't focus on anything. I am just feeling like everything's in a swirl right now. You gotta help me figure out a way that I can be more effective. Then I might say, okay, let's look at, this might have to do with your right and left hemisphere. Let's take a look at it. Here's a real big picture. And then as we go into more coaching, I'll go into more depth around this. And so there's three layers of what I need to know, and the person who needs to know the least is generally the client, because they want to solve for something. They want to, move forward in a way. They don't want most of my clients don't want a neuroscience lecture. But when I say, here's what I'm suspecting may be happening, and here might be a way forward based on bringing your two sides of the brain more into harmony, the skeptics listen more closely, and they're more willing to engage. So me having that knowledge and the confidence in the depth of that knowledge gives me more capacity as a coach, like that. So that's what I would say. Now, and this is just one example. It's just right and left hemisphere. You might come to me and say, I'm mad at everyone. I don't seem to be remembering anything. I let's see, I can't focus. My brain feels foggy. I have no idea what's going on or what's wrong. And then my hypothesis is I'm going to start asking questions to see what your level of stress is in your life. Because those are hallmarks, those are classic signs. Just like a doctor is going to say, try to figure out if you have COVID. You know, how's your taste? Did you lose your taste? Are you coughing? You know, like they're going to ask those questions and then go, okay, based on all that, let's give you a COVID test. I'm still not sure you have COVID, but we're going to do the test because what you're telling me points to that. It's the same for me. I don't know for sure that it's stress, but everything you're telling me is what I know about stress. So I'm going to direct my coaching in a particular direction based on the neuroscience of stress. So it is neuroscience. And then that's going to say, if it's not, your stress levels are fine, something else is going on. It's not COVID, it's something else. But if you're telling me, yeah, I got this, I got that, you know, my parents are coming for 2 weeks and they stress me out, whatever it is, we're going to not look at, you know, the symptoms. We're going to look at the cause and see if there's a way to address the cause.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And it's, for me, it highlights the really delicate and complex picture here that, like, I've heard it said both that we need to be sort of scientifically accurate in our coaching and in our work. If we're going to say something about the brain, it should be roughly true, which makes a kind of sense. And I've also heard it said by equally smart people, we need it to be useful and we need it to be, it's a model. All models are simplifications. Like I heard, I'm thinking back to a training course that I went on. It was an agile coaching course, and the facilitator introduced the triune brain model, which is, yeah. So
I know it was like, I felt like that's where this was going.
Yeah.
Oh my God, we can talk about that. But yeah, it's
so what?
It's not true.
Yeah, but then does it, like, how much does it matter? Like, and I go back and forth on this because the way this person said it was like, here's the neuroscience, there's the triune brain. If you haven't heard of the triune brain, it's you can explain it better than I can, what the 3 levels of
It's
reptilian.
sort of the idea that the brain evolved like if you were to look at like geologically, like if you look at rocks, you know, there's sort of this strata, this strata, this strata, or a layer cake or something like that. And that we have this older reptilian brain, we have sort of a mid-level brain, which is the mammalian brain, and then we have the human brain, and it's very hierarchical. And under certain conditions, we go back to the reptilian brain, and you can say, oh, you know, I had an amygdala hijack, and that was my reptilian brain, and all of that. And that has been something that, first of all, was never meant to be taken as true. It was always meant to be a metaphor. But it has been communicated, and it's one of the most entrenched neuroscience myths because it's not actually the way evolution works. It's not the way our brains work. We don't have something that's sort of intact and ready to activate again. And one of my favorite neuroscience colleagues basically says, no one has a reptile brain unless you're a reptile. So, and even some reptiles have prefrontal cortices, so that's all funny. Now, here is the problem with the useful versus true. I'm looking for the intersection of both. I believe that we owe it to people because here's the problem, and I often will ask this in my classes. I'll say, what's the problem? I'll ask the question, what's the problem with assuming that we have these 3-layer brain, and we have this reptile brain? And my students are brilliant, and they'll come up with lots of like awareness, like, oh, it kind of lets people off the hook. If we are always reacting to things, then it means that all we can do is hope to do better the next time. It's not actually how the brain works. The brain is not a reaction. The brain is a prediction machine. We predict that we are driven by our predictions, not our reactions. And it's just, there's the other theories of the brain are more useful for actually developing your brain in a productive way. So I was originally taught, let me just do a little bit on this, because I was originally taught the triune brain at some point along the way. Like, what the heck? And I taught it for a few years, up until about 10 years ago. I taught it because it's very, compelling. Like, oh, my reptile brain did that.
Have you seen the thing with the hand?
Yeah.
You flip the prefrontal cortex switches off, and then you lose your shit, and then you do the amygdala stuff, and then the job is to help get the clever prefrontal cortex to take back control or something.
Yeah, and
it even has a hand gesture. You see?
Yeah, that's a Dan Siegel thing, and it's that part. Let me give you my metaphor, because there's there's just a tweak that I would do in there. So. What do I want to say? So anyway, I was taught this. Then I started following the work of a brilliant neuroscientist named Lisa Feldman Barrett, who is doing the best work in the world, along with other people who are sort of in that arena. So she's doing something working in something she calls constructed emotions, not innate emotions, but how we that emotions are a construction from our brain, using back to the body, that the body plays a role in emotion, and that our language and culture plays a role in emotion. We express emotion, we name emotions based on the language and the cultural assumptions that we have available. So it's a much more, our emotional state is pulled together from these four things. So I started following her, and one of the very first things she said is, we don't have the triune brain. And I'm like, shit, I've been teaching that. And this is actually one of the things I love, because neuroscience keeps me really humble, because I've had to adjust and change our curriculum, over the years as major, usually small tweaks, but occasionally a big one. And that was a big one. We had to take some stuff out, bring it in. But he said, how am I going to describe how the brain works if it doesn't work in these three layers? How do I help people understand the interaction of the brain? So I came up with a metaphor, which is your brain is an orchestra. And what's happening is some parts of the orchestra sometimes get really loud. And it's not that, and this is what the research shows. So the old version is reptile brain takes over, you've lost connection to your higher brain, you have to bring the higher brain back on. What this metaphor says is sometimes it feels like the only thing you can hear is the drum section. It's really loud. That might be your more of the part of your brain that's very attuned to threat, and the drums get loud. But what the research shows is you don't lose your prefrontal cortex. It just might be quieter. It might be harder to hear the violins. So what you have to do is kind of tune your listening. Tune my listening. How do I make the violins louder? How do I breathe? And maybe the drums will calm down. And how do I, if I want to develop my brain, what areas of my orchestra are really good and what areas of my orchestra need some practice? So it's a much more, to me, a much more useful, growth-oriented, development-oriented metaphor.
Yeah, that is nice, because if you didn't have your prefrontal cortex, none of the signal would make sense to you. Like if you're having that so-called amygdala hijack, well, you still need the other parts of your brain that tell you what objects are and what social dynamics are and what words mean and all these different things. The idea that it switches off doesn't make any sense. Yeah, that's a way of capturing the same idea, but in a more literate.
It acknowledges the fact that sometimes parts of our brain are saying, pay attention, this is scary, pay attention, be on alert, like that. But what brain scans actually show is that you do still have activity you might have a lot of activity in more lower brain areas. And I'm just showing the brain right now, which is, a cross section of the brain. And there are lower brain areas that are more attuned to more. That's also critical. Nothing's absolute in the brain. They're more attuned to threat, and they can get really loud because that's part of how we survive. But we can basically, also check in with the higher brain, and you're going to see activity. You might see a lot of activity in the lower brain areas, particularly the amygdala, but you're also going to see activity in the prefrontal cortex. It just may not be as much. And we can work with that, I think, more effectively than just waiting for our amygdala hijack to calm down.
How do you help someone work with the different parts of their with their different systems, maybe as typified by the different parts of their brain? Is that good enough? I'm really cautious about how I ask these questions, because it's like, the prefrontal cortex doesn't do that, and the amygdala doesn't do. It's not fear, doesn't live in the amygdala. It's like it plays an elevated. So it's very hard to ask a question about neuroscience. But
And I like to say the brain's not a computer. It's a system, and even apparently computers even operate more this way. Things are fragmented. Things are all over the place. There isn't like one chunk of. I don't know that much about computers. You maybe know more than me, but that the brain is. I think of the brain as a system of systems. It's more of an ecosystem than a computer. It's much more of an interaction in any. It's like if you think about, and then I'll answer your question. If you think about the ecosystem in your garden, for example. Every part of it is important, down to the worms and the ants and the wasps and the sun and the rain, and you disrupt any part of that. It's one of the real concerns right now with global warming, it's global climate change, et cetera, is if we lose the bees, we lose humanity, because every part of it is playing a critical role. And so that's, how I think about the brain. It's not this part's more hierarchically better. Prefrontal cortex needs to keep the limbic system in line. It's like, no, those are the worms in my garden. They're helping. Every part of it is important. So what do I do when one part of the orchestra becomes too loud? Or isn't loud enough? So what would you do if you were an orchestra conductor, or working with an orchestra? What would you do? I'm going to ask you that. Like, what would you do?
Okay. Go to Pocket, read How to Be Orchestra Conductor.
Go to AI. How do we?
Gemini. I am an orchestra conductor stuck on a stage. It's very, very urgent that you answer this question.
More about how would you help the orchestra develop? It's not necessarily it might be the conductor, but it might be the direct whoever does that in an orchestra.
Yeah, I guess you'd listen to what the current thing is, and you would try and make a judgment about what do we need more of, what do we need less of, and then you'd signal to them like, hey, dial up the strings and dial back on the bassoon.
Yeah, and if I were running I'm out of my depth in this metaphor, because I'm like, the conductor doesn't run the orchestra, but whoever's in charge of like the orchestra development, who's doing the practices and all of that, I'm going to listen, and I'm going to say, strings, what's going on? Strings, or I'm going to say, we need the string section needs more practice. And in performance, I might use a hand gesture that, lowers one, heightens the other. But I think in terms of coaching, it's less about performance and it's more about how am I developing my orchestra. So I'm going to listen and then look to see where do I put more attention. So here's a practical example of that. This very, very common, where I find people, particularly in the organizational space, who are very good at the head, but they're very disconnected from any information from their bodies. And that's part of your orchestra. Listening to what's coming up will tell you a lot about intuition, will help you with decision making, will help you with empathy, all of that. And so I might sort of use the analogy of, wow, you've got really strong violins, like you're cognitively incredibly good, but you have this other section, let's call it the brass section, I don't know, and they haven't practiced enough. So we're going to practice that section, because your violins don't need any more practice. They can go on vacation, or they can take a little break. But we're going to work with the part of the area that actually is less practiced. And this comes back to the idea of neuroplasticity, that wherever we put our focus and attention, we tend to get better at. So we're going to look at some ways of bringing what the body says into consciousness. Or if I'm very good at details, that tends to be more left hemisphere, but I'm not good at reading the room, which tends to be more right hemisphere, I will put attention on reading the room and practice that. And I will give my client assignments about reading the room and come back and debrief with me. I'm a safe place. I'm a safe place for you to be a bad room reader. Let's talk about it. So it's all, I think that's totally the role of coaching, is to develop the orchestra. And first, you have to notice what needs to be.
That brings together the role of coaching and how to be guided by and informed by neuroscience, but still having the client and the actual task at hand present and sort of first and foremost. Yeah. What's if someone has listened to this, they go, great, I should get much better at neuroscience. What should they what should they read? Where should they look? What are the pathways to getting better at being informed by neuroscience?
So two immediate things that come to mind. So I have a really good, for years I was looking for what's the best basic book, and I couldn't find one. But one came out in the last 2 or 3 years, and it's by, I mentioned Lisa Feldman Barrett, and maybe you can put this in the show notes. Her book, 7.5 Lessons About the Brain, really good, rock solid neuroscience, very easily digestible. It's kind of fun because you can just give yourself a goal to I'll just read one lesson this week. And you can really trust her. She's very cutting edge in terms of her neuroscience. So I recommend that book again and again and again. And honestly, if you're a coach and you want to be able to really use this in your practice, come and do our program, because we have the advantage of being both coaches and neuroscience experts. And so we understand how to apply it. And often neuroscientists don't really understand the world of coaching in terms of how you really apply this with people. And often, as you were mentioning, Daniel, coaches don't understand the incredible depth and complexity of neuroscience and how all of these systems are working together. And that's something that we do in our program, is we go into that level of complexity so people come out feeling like, I have a really good generalist understanding of neuroscience now.
Great. And where can people find out more about you and your work and your programs?
It's my company is BEabove Leadership.com. And we're just on the web, and just to look under programs is a tab. And we tend to start new cohorts every quarter. And our cohorts are small, so there's lots of time for questions and what about it. And we practice everything. So if I'm teaching about the prefrontal cortex, we're going to have a coaching tool that goes along with it, and you're going to practice it in class. So it's really applied. And then we're going to come back and debrief. Did it work? Did it not work? If it didn't work, why didn't it work? What's going on? And so there's this I think it's a very integrative approach to this, where you don't have to memorize, because you're going to get the learning, especially the applied learning, in your bones.
Great. And thank you so much for joining us on Intelligent Teams today.
Great fun. Thank you so much, Daniel.
Thank you for listening to the Intelligent Teams podcast. I've been your host, Daniel Susser. If you enjoyed this episode, there's a good chance you'll enjoy being a subscriber to the Intelligent Teams Substack. It's intelligentteams.substack.com. You'll receive a free weekly newsletter featuring an episode of this podcast or writings about cognitive science and building intelligent teams. See you next time.